I can still hear the cackle echoing in that drafty studio, tucked just behind a bakery on Rue Oberkampf, when the wind outside rattled the paint-crusted windows. The place always smelled of coffee and linseed oil. Sometimes, in the colder months, a trace of mildew drifted up from the stone floor. That day, the usual crowd stood in the yellow-lit space. Classmates, acquaintances from the école, a handful of instructors, and of course my mother. She must have taken a late lunch from her government job, hair pulled tight, a little pinched with nervous energy. I sometimes wonder why she came at all. My turn was last. The critiques that day had been brisk but sharp, less about guidance and more about underscoring who belonged in the room and who didn't. When my name was called, I rolled my shoulders and wheeled my small robot into the center of the room. There wasn't much to see, just an assemblage of 3D printed plastic, wires, and a circuit board blinking behind a frosted panel. A small arm crudely serving coffee from one cup to another. It glitched and jittered, but it worked. Mostly, I introduced it, my clunky prototype, not a painting, not an installation, but a gesture toward my real dream. To create machines that could learn and create, not just repeat, not just busy work, but something alive, something that could help people or offer comfort or simple companionship. At first there was silence save for the faint click of the professor's pen, then the laughter started. It was Laurent who barked out first, shaking his curly head. "Coffee-serving robot, Benjamin, are you serious? In Paris? We have cafes for that, non." Laughter rippled out. I smiled sheepishly, fingers laced together, but it felt like stepping nude into the icy Seine. My mother's mouth pressed into a disapproving line. She had always said I should have tried for the civil service or at least teach maths, something steady. She didn't say anything, but the way her fingers clutched her handbag said enough. Professor Marchand stepped forward, peering at my robot with a long face. "This may be an interesting exercise, but it's a distraction. Poetry, painting, sculpture, that's what concerns us. Why waste your intelligence on playthings?" His assessment was swift and the crowd murmured along. I spotted Sabine, the only other student who ever smiled at me, but even she looked away. The critique ended with mocking applause. I packed the robot and watched through the grey glass as people drifted off toward their chosen futures. I remember the sunlight outside was cold and indifferent. On the metro home, my mother sat beside me silent. At Bleak, she finally spoke. "Perhaps you should focus on something more practical, Benjamin. Everyone says this robot's nonsense is childish. You are not a child." She stared at her hands, cracked from cleaning, and I felt smaller than I had ever been. The hardest part wasn't the laughter. Even the disdain could be brushed away like dust from a battered coat. What haunted me was the quiet, the gulf of silence afterward. For weeks, nobody mentioned my project. Invitations dried up. Even Sabine avoided me at lectures. I kept working quietly at home in my cramped room above the boulangerie, a space so small I had to crouch to change my shirt. My father was gone by then. He'd left before I was old enough to read, mailing only the occasional postcard from Nice, always addressed to my mother. She carried on, never spoke of him. We kept each other company over simple dinners, rarely talking about dreams. It wasn't entirely hopeless. For every closed door I found one, just one slightly ajar. I published papers online, wrote to strangers who posted about machine learning in forums, coded until dawn by the orange glow of the street lamps. My little robots multiplied, spilling out from under my desk, each a little better, a little smarter. The next winter my mother offered a rare olive branch, presenting me with a soldering iron wrapped in cheap gift paper. "Even if it's useless," she said, "at least do it well." I applied to startups in Paris, but the replies when they came were brief. Too early, too strange, too much risk. I waited tables in the morning, worked in the bakery at night. In odd hours, code and coffee powered my world. A year passed, then another, and sometimes hope felt like an old bruise, tender when pressed too hard. One winter night, storm lashing the windows, my email pinged with a reply from a woman named Ria in Berlin. She'd read one of my blog posts, liked my approach, said she was building something with conversational AI, had a little funding. Would I work with her? I printed her message out and stared at it for hours, hands trembling. I left Paris 2 weeks later, squeezing my life into one battered suitcase, clutching a box of wires and dreams. Berlin was colder than I'd imagined. The city offered little in the way of romance or nostalgia, only wind, graffiti, scattered promise. But the startup that Ria ran, Campanio, felt like home. She and her co-founder, an Englishman named Jamal, were both relentless and kind. Our work began in a former dentist's office, white walls, the faint scent of antiseptic. We coded and argued, built and rebuilt. Bottles of Club Mate littered the floor, pizza crusts piled on the windowsill, post-it notes in 4 languages taped to every flat surface. We failed over and over, but each failure brought us closer to something real. I poured my whole being into Companio's core, a neural network that could talk, joke, even listen for moods in a user's voice. Not just smart, empathetic, it was messy, unpredictable work. Code scrawled in the margins of napkins, phone calls home at odd hours. My mother's voice grew sharper, worried. You live like a student, when will you grow up? Sometimes I wondered that myself, hunched over my laptop in the blue hours before sunrise, eyelids heavy, heart mutinous with longing. Yet our little project grew. Investors visited, a Swedish venture capitalist, a somber Frenchman in black-rimmed glasses, a woman from Singapore who wore flame-red shoes. Some said no, but one said yes. With that, Companio sprinted forward. After 3 years, we'd made something astonishing, a companion AI capable of reading the room, of soothing loneliness, making people feel just a little less alone. Hospitals in Germany piloted our tech for elderly patients. Universities called, then hospitals in France. Companio's logo, our little circle of blue dots, started popping up in magazine stories, then finally on a billboard at Alexanderplatz. Success was not the thunderclap I'd imagined, but a slow accumulation, the quiet click of small victories stacking upon each other. We opened a Paris office, just 3 blocks from the studio where I'd first been mocked. The irony didn't escape me. Ria insisted I take the lead on the French launch. The plan, a grand demo at the École, open to professors, industry reps, old colleagues, and, she grinned, bring your family. The day of the event, Paris glistened with early spring. Sunlight spilled through plane trees onto the white facades of buildings, the city waking with a warmth I barely remembered. My hands shook as I dressed, dark jacket, pressed shirt. I checked my reflection, a little older, eyes shrewder, but the same narrow jaw and stubborn brow. Sabine was there at the hall entrance, her hair streaked with early grey, papers clutched to her chest. She didn't recall me immediately, but after I introduced myself, surprise lit her face. Benjamin, from the critique group. I smiled, steadier than I felt, still building my robots. We shared coffee, real this time, and caught up. She'd stayed at the École teaching sculpture. She didn't mention the old days, but something in her expression flickered with apology. My mother arrived, dressed in a modest blue dress, lips pressed tight, fingers worrying her necklace. I greeted her at the door, heart thundering as she allowed herself to be led inside. She had never visited my Berlin office, never used the app, said technology was for the young. The hall filled with the city's gatekeepers. Old professors, skeptical classmates, journalists and officials in smart suits. Laurent arrived, as loud as ever, beard flecked with grey, laughing with his circle of friends. My skin prickled at the sight. I stood at the podium, hands trembling before the crowd. The technician gave me a nod from the wings. Behind me, on a screen stretched wide, Companio's logo shimmered. I recalled the studio, the laughter, the ridicule, and felt the old fear crawling up my spine. I glanced at my mother, at her upturned face. Her eyes shone with a watery anxiety, but she nodded ever so slightly. It was enough, I began. 5 years ago, you told me robots were useless here. Coffee machines, you called them, but to me, a robot was never about coffee. It was about connection, the billions of moments we spend alone, wishing for someone to understand, to listen. Crowd murmured, restive. I pressed forward. I'd like to introduce you to Delphine, our AI companion. She is live, she can hear you, see you, even sense your mood. If you'll permit me, I'd like to show you what she can do. The demonstration began. Delphine greeted the professor in elegant French, picking up on the tremble in his voice, a hint of sadness, perhaps a personal loss. She responded with empathy, referencing a Baudelaire poem about spring's renewal. The professor's lips parted in stunned silence. Then a volunteer, an old woman in a neat suit, a hospital administrator, I learned later, spoke of her patient's loneliness. Delphine responded, voice tinged with warmth, remembering the administrator's own words from a prior interview, stitching them into a tapestry of encouragement. The crowd stilled, the silence loaded now with awe rather than scorn. As the final test, I turned to the audience. Anyone else? My heart thudded as Laurent stepped forward, smile twisted. Can your machine handle criticism? He asked, voice booming. Let's find out, I said, my palms sweated. I resisted the urge to wipe them on my jacket. Laurent addressed Delphine in rapid-fire French, peppering her with sarcasm, technical jargon, even a bit of provencal dialect. Delphine handled every jibe, every twist, her responses witty, gentle, and deft. The room burst into real applause, not mocking but genuine, a wave that carried through the space. Laurent's face flushed, chagrined but not cruel. After the demo, the crowd thronged the stage. Professors, reporters, even old classmates wanted to try Delphine, to ask questions, to see the impossible made real. I caught my mother weaving through the crowd, hesitating near the edge. I went to her, heart in my throat. "Did you like it?" She looked at me for a long moment, lips quivering, hands pressed to her chest. "Your father would have been proud," she whispered, and I was wrong. Truly. For the first time since I was small, she let herself hug me, not brisk but close and trembling. People stared, but I didn't care. Later, I slipped out into the spring dusk. The city stretched before me, old and new. Sabine joined me on the steps and we sat in quiet. "You proved them wrong," she said, "but what drove you all these years?" I thought of the ridicule, the loneliness, the relentless work and isolation. I traced the outline of my journey in the seam of my jacket, feeling each bump, each moment of doubt. "I never wanted to show them," I answered, "but to show myself. That I was more than their laughter." Down the street, the lights in the old studio flicked on for the evening class. I watched the shadows shift in the windows, the ghosts of my former self. "I never belonged in that room," I whispered. "But maybe now I belong in this one." Behind me, the lingering applause echoed. The city breathed, alive and brimming, and I let myself finally believe I had come home.